up, guys? Coming to you from a gorgeous inner city neighborhood in Austin, Texas, where my company got hired to do an interior remodel on this 1920s craftsman style bungalow. I love this style house. This is a beautiful house. Now what's going on here is you see the second story on the back of the house. That was an addition that was added less than 10 years ago, and my assumption is that when that addition was added, they also did some caulk and paint and kind of gave a facelift to the house. Now my new client, when they bought this, I wasn't involved in the sale. So when we got hired to do the interior remodel, we wanted to take a gaze at the outside too to really understand what's happening. And as you're about to see, there's some hidden problems with this house, and I think there's some really good lessons that we can learn from this old house that got a facelift, and they made a few critical mistakes on this house that have led to some rot and some mold. Today's build show about how to do it right on an old house. Let's get going. All right, so the front of the house, gorgeous house, you know, from the street, looks amazing, and you certainly don't see any problems from the street. But as we started poking around, it became immediately apparent that we had a couple critical mistakes that were made when this remodel addition happened. Now this front porch got, it looks like maybe a column upgrade and some caulking and paint. And if you look at the base of this column, you can see that this base molding here around this wood column was caulked tight to the wood deck and was caulked tight in, so that if any moisture got in from the top of the column or wherever, there's no great place for that moisture to get out. My buddy David Nicastro says it's not about keeping the water out, it's about letting it out. And let's see what happened here. So we just poked a really small hole and realized, oh goodness gracious, we've got some serious rot down here. The water that got into this column, invariably water is going to get in your house somewhere, had no path to get out. And so the wood deck has been rotted, and now this one by kind of base molding here is rotted as well. We took this one off on the other side and you can see it a little bit better. Here's the base molding. Just a regular white pine was used, nothing special. Now if we were to use pressure treated lumber, maybe we would have gotten a little bit more time before the rot happened, but either way, this is a fundamental mistake that I see often. Caulking these columns in place, not leaving room for water to get out and air to flow in. And as you can see, after just a few short years, not even a decade, we've got some massive rot. Now I'm really glad to see though that this 4x4 column, which appears to be a structural column, is not affected. So we don't have a structural issue here. It's really a cosmetic issue. When we fix this, we're gonna make sure we have a good air gap here, and we're gonna make an air gap at the top somewhere so that when the water gets in, it can get out and air can flow in and dry this out. Had we had an air gap and a spot for this to dry, this probably wouldn't be rotted. Now let's look at the rest of the house and see if we can get a gander on how the original house was built and how the addition was built. So as we walk around this part of the house, we're still in the original first floor section here. And when we pulled a few pieces of siding off, this is a pretty common teardrop shaped siding. The nice thing about this siding is it has a lip over top of the next board. You can kind of see that here and here. But you'll notice that each one of these pieces of siding is caulked in tight. And that's good for an old house like this in that it's shedding the water, but any water that were to get in on this old house this house had some forgiveness. This cellulose insulation was likely added, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years ago, maybe in the 80s when the energy crisis happened. But when the house was first built, there was no insulation in these cavities. And what you're gonna notice is there's wood right on the inside. That's shiplap. Chip and Joanna have kind of popularized that as an interior cladding, but houses of this generation, the early 1900s, this is before sheet goods were around, and that shiplap was actually structural. It kept the shear value on the house, and it's not unusual to see siding right on the studs. No tar paper or anything on the outside, just siding right on the studs. Now likely where there's a joint in this siding where two pieces came together, it was caulked, but there'd be some incidental moisture that would get in. Now here's the deal with cellulose. Cellulose is a paper-based insulation, and the nice thing about this insulation in particular is that water that gets in is actually absorbed by this. Like a sponge, it moves all through the insulation, and if that water were to hit these studs or the sheathing, this is real sheathing, solid wood, it would soak it up and it would allow it to dry to both the outside potentially, although this was caulked and painted pretty well, or dry to the inside of the house. So that's a good thing, which means when we pull that siding off in those locations, we're not finding any rot in those areas. On the other hand, I am seeing a little bit of rot right here. Look at the bottom of the stud. I'm not exactly sure what happened here, but I would guess that this penetration here that's happening from the Freon line allowed some water, probably a larger amount of water, to get into the space, and that's causing some rot. Same thing on this Freon line here. Look, we can see some rot on this stud, but it looks like now we're into a new section. See this new 2x material? That looks like some pressure treated 2x6. So now we must be on the remodeled section of the house. And yep, we're seeing this. We're seeing some tar paper and some OSB sheathing. So this is definitely the newer section. I don't know the exact age of this remodel, but I suspect it's been within the last 10 years. So really pretty darn recent in the scheme of things. Now let's go around the back side of the house. And I wish I would have gotten here yesterday. My crew that's working on this is on a lunch break. They've already started to replace some of the rotted OSB with some zip system sheathing. But as we scan up the house, we can see where the zip system sheathing stops and the OSB starts. We can already start to see some of the problems on the OSB. There's some random rot in the field right there, and that's where a seam where the siding came together allowed water to get in. It made it through the tar paper and started rotting the OSB. That siding is directly on the tar paper, and then the tar paper is directly on the OSB. There's no air gap. There's no way for water that gets in to dry or to get out. Now we've got bigger problems underneath this window right here. Let's actually go up on the scaffolding and take a look at that. Okay, so this window is 1 story up. This is a standard kind of wood modern window that the builder added this additional sill to the bottom of the window, and it was probably just nailed on. The point is though, look where the trim was on the window, and actually you can see that right here. The trim overlapped the window, which overlapped the siding, and the only thing that was keeping water out of this cavity was this big bead of caulk. They actually double beaded it, which was smart on their part, and then this bead of caulking. So when that 1x6 was here, it landed onto the sill. If there was any failure in any of that caulking above or here, water would land in this spot right here where the sill was up against the tar paper in the sheathing. And look at the rot. Again, this is just a few short years old, and this OSB is absolutely wood. It's, you know, it's literally falling off the wall. And not only that, it looks to me like we have some structural issues as well. Let me get out my rot detection tool. I actually brought it with me. It's calibrated as well. That's a joke. And check this out. Look, we've got some serious rot already in these 2x4s, which have only been in place for a few short years. So we're gonna have to do some structural work to this most likely before we resheath it. And again, this OSB is in terrible condition. Now, all this could have been avoided with 2 simple changes. What we needed to do was set the window in a sill pan, number 1. And next, we needed to integrate the window flange with the WRB, whatever we're using, on here. And then the other thing is, with this wood siding, we want to space it off of the sheathing. We're going to space it off the zip system so there's an air gap behind it. They call that a rain screen. I've used them and talked about them for years, but they give you some forgiveness. They give you the ability for water to get in and then get back out. Remember, it's not about keeping it out, it's about letting it out. We're also gonna put a head flashing on these windows. These windows never had head flashings. They're totally rotted above. You can see that head flash right there. I poked in with my knife and checked the leak detector, and sure enough, rotted big time. Now we can go back with wood siding. Of course we could go to a James Hardie or something like that, but this teardrop shape is really iconic. It really is the style of this house, and this is a true wood sheathing. So what we're gonna do though is when we go back with this, we're gonna make sure that any water that gets past the caulk joints can land into a space that's an air gap that will have a drainage space at the bottom, and we're gonna make sure we have an air gap at the top as well, so that when that rain stops and the sun comes out, any water that gets to the moisture on this wood can be driven into that air gap and be dried up or down and out. Really, really important. We'll follow back up on this house in a few weeks or months as we get some of these details going. But I wanted you to have the same eyes that I do when you see these houses. They look amazing at the street. I'm sure this sold at a really top-notch price because it looks so good. The paint job was amazing. But in reality, we need to reskin this entire house. We're gonna have to pull everything, verify where the rot and problems are. Because if we don't, this kind of issue right here, which is only a few years old, if this were to continue unchecked, we would have a major structural issue here, and these studs could be all rotted through in another 5 or 10 years, which would cause major structural problems. So it's really important to get these details right at the beginning. Guys, if you're not currently a Build Show subscriber, we publish new content here every Tuesday and Friday, lots of nerdy topics like this. It's important for you, as especially the younger builders out there, to learn from me and the other old guys that have experienced problems and seen this on job sites. And speaking of which, I actually have several other contributors over on my Build Show network that I've founded. So we're publishing 10 new videos a week over on buildshownetwork.com, including a brand new series of an entire house build start to finish, where all the details were absolutely nailed. These kinds of problems that you're seeing on this house are not going to be seen on the kind of houses we're building today. So go check that out. It's called the Build Show Build Series. My builder friend Jake Bruton in Columbia, Missouri built the Build Show Build House. Steve Basic, an amazing architect out of Boston, designed it. And the two of them made a 12-part series. You can watch all 12 parts over on buildshownetwork.com. I'll put a link in the description. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on the buildshow.com.